The 20th century saw the dawn of a new type of warfare. Machines ruled the battlefield.
Conventional infantry assault across no man's land was bound to fail. Flesh and blood simply could not get through that type of defense.
A fierce arms race led to even more deadly weapons.
Those gunners on the tanks had rounds in their cannons, and they were ready to execute if they were told to.
Behind the lines, the development of powerful and innovative vehicles meant the difference between victory and defeat.
This is absolutely one of the unsung heroes of the Second World War.
The relentless pursuit of military supremacy would lead to machines capable of destroying humanity itself.
There are very few mistakes you could make that wouldn't have some kind of catastrophic consequence.
This time, the ultimate combat engineers and their impressive machines.
The Royal Engineers are essentially problem solvers on the battlefield. Fortifications, digging, power, construction, these are the things that they've got to solve.
In every major conflict, from the Great War to the present day, the Royal Engineers have been on the front line, above and below ground, using their ingenious machinery and remarkable courage to save lives.
Each time he walked to the device was another walk of danger.
All of these combat machines have been used by the elite British military corps, known as the Royal Engineers. Their battle experience goes back centuries.
The Royal Engineers have fought in 92 major worldwide battles and also 2 world wars.
They are both highly trained soldiers and combat engineers, providing firepower, battlefield detonations, technical expertise, and the latest equipment to keep the British Army well defended and advancing towards the enemy.
The value of the Royal Engineers to the British Army is enormous. They are the people who enable troops to go where they might not otherwise get. The engineer, the sapper, is the one who has to get out and clear the obstacles, create the roadways, bridge the gaps.
The Royal Engineers have been everywhere and they have done everything, and they've taken part in every single major conflict that the British Army has.
One of the Royal Engineers' greatest technological triumphs came in one of those conflicts, but it was born out of a humiliating defeat. On the 19th of August 1942, 3 years into the Second World War, British and Canadian forces launched an attack on the German-occupied French port of Dieppe. The hit-and-run raid was a disaster. About 400 men were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The Allied tanks never got off the beach. Each one was destroyed or abandoned.
The armour had formed very badly at Dieppe where the tanks got stuck on the shingle. Clearly, if your armour stops moving, German guns will find it very quickly.
The elite British Corps of Royal Engineers had found it almost impossible to clear minefields and destroy tank obstacles while under intense enemy fire. Working on foot, they were mown down. The army vowed to never again let the engineers be so exposed. Surprisingly, a solution would come from a combat machine that had got stuck on the beach at Dieppe. A tank named in honour of the British Prime Minister, the Churchill. He would be given a second chance and a new role. If an amphibious invasion of Europe was to succeed, the Allies would need a vehicle that was capable of dealing with beaches, concrete tank traps, and seawalls, and vitally able to transport the Royal Engineers safely as they did their dangerous work. The solution was staring the army in the face. This is one of the few surviving Churchill tanks, now being lovingly restored in a workshop in the southeast of England.
We've been working on this Churchill for around 6 months now. We're just about on completion and just finishing off the last bits. We're going to put on the final bits of rear deck armour that cover the engine and the gearbox, and then refit the new exhausts that just need a little bit of modification to get them to sit in squarely.
Restoring vintage combat machines is a battle against decades of wear and tear.
The downside of working on tanks like this, they're World War II, so they're about 70 years old, and taking them apart, everything's rusted, seized up, lots of heat, the armour's heavy, and everything you need good lifting equipment to get out. The upside is by the time you come to put it back together, everything's been cleaned up, all the threads are clean, and bolts, in theory, bolts back together perfectly.
In a way, this is the forgotten tank. I think this is as important to warfare in the Second World War as the Spitfire was in the air.
Back in 1942, the man who saw the potential of the Churchill as a tank to help with the invasion of Europe was a Canadian officer called J.J. Denovan. He thought it could be easily modified to carry a unit of Royal Engineers inside.
The real difference with the Churchill, it's unique really, is that with normal tanks, the track runs top and bottom, obviously, and most tanks push the armour to the inside, and you don't get storage space here. Churchill unusually ran the track all the way along the top, creating storage space on the inside, which you would not otherwise have had. And that gave it so much extra space to store the things the engineers needed, both while fighting from the tank and when they dismounted to destroy obstacles and deal with mines and charges and so forth. The side door was a real help, not only for getting out of the tank to perform tasks, but actually for loading heavy munitions and stores in. No other tank that we had in that era had a door in the side. It's a fantastic attribute, and frankly, it was also really useful when the tanks were hit, because the crew could escape more quickly.
Lieutenant Denovan decided the best way to convince the top brass that this tank was the answer to the problems exposed at Dieppe was to build a prototype.
Denovan managed to get hold of a Churchill tank for just long enough to empty it and rig it as a mock engineer tank and then to demonstrate it. He set it up, he said to the officials, the powers that be, this is the future for engineer tanks, this is what Dieppe got wrong. If we build these, we can invade, we can land on a hostile frontier and get through the obstacles we couldn't deal with at Dieppe. And the authorities were so impressed with what he had created that they went for it. They said, right, this is going to be how we get the engineers into battle.
Lieutenant Denovan's tank became known as an AVRE, an Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers. Production of the Churchill AVREs began in mid-1943. By D-Day in June, a year later, 180 were available for the invasion force. In that time, other variants of the AVRE had been created. Denovan didn't just want a tank to carry Royal Engineers and their equipment. He wanted an AVRE with firepower. He got one. An AVRE fitted with a 290mm petard tank mortar.
The petard mortar was an ingenious device. It enabled a huge projectile to be fired from a tank, something which the normal tank gun could not do because the recoil from firing 40 pounds of weapon onto a target would take a normal tank gun out of the back of the turret. So although it had limited range of maybe 75 to 100 yards, it was probably the most effective way of demolishing a building from within a tank that any of the armies possessed at that point. It was a stroke of genius. In one go, he created an engineered tank that could fight obstacles from within armour and deploy people when they had to do the things by hand. It was the Swiss Army knife tank.
But the modifications to the Churchill AVRE didn't stop there. Enter Percy Hobart, an innovative but maverick tank warfare tactician who was languishing in the Home Guard when Churchill brought him out of retirement.
He was a tactician. He understood that to get a tank to breach an obstacle to reach its objective, you often needed to clear that obstacle out of the way. And reconnaissance showed in the run-up to Normandy that the German fortifications around the coast and inland were enormously sophisticated. And he set about overseeing the invention of techniques and adaptations to the tank, which would enable it to cross ditches, overcome walls, knock down walls and fortifications, clear mines. Just about any engineering task that was needed was put into the Churchill, and in one form or another, the tank came up with the answer.
The variants on the Churchill Avery he helped create were so unusual, they became known as Hobart's funnies. But they had a serious purpose.
Well, the Churchill had so many variants for the Normandy landings and beyond, most of them based on the Avery. And if you think of it in sequence, to enable the troops and the tanks to come ashore, it carried a huge bobbin of fabric on the front, which would get across soft shingle, barbed wire obstacles, and enable it to go where tanks in Dieppe had failed to go.
Another Avery operated by the Royal Engineers was the fascine, which could cross deep trenches.
It was this great big bundle of material, sticks held together by wire, which could be dropped into an anti-tank ditch and then driven over.
The 40-ton Churchill Crocodile Avery was a terrifying flame-throwing tank, equipped with its own trailer carrying the lethal fuel. So how did these extraordinary combat machines perform on D-Day?
The Avery was a huge help in the conditions that the British and the Canadians faced in landing in Normandy. It made all the difference getting off the beaches. And I think it's clear that without them, the casualties would have been higher. It might have been much more difficult to establish a foothold and get inland to achieve the breakthrough.
Nigel Montgomery is sending his collection of Churchills to a tank museum where their brilliance can be appreciated by the general public.
We've restored these tanks to a point where now we want people to see them and see them in large numbers, which we can't achieve here. So it enables us to tell the story of ingenious people, whether it's Lieutenant Denovan, whether it's General Hobart, and indeed many nameless people who contributed to the design, the maintenance, and the evolution of the Churchill. And this is their story. And this tank is probably the most important one that the British Army used in the Second World War.
For centuries, the Royal Engineers have excelled on the battlefield. But in the First World War, one of their greatest achievements was not above ground, but under it. As the Allied armies pushed out from the D-Day beaches in June 1944, they needed a combat machine to help them deal with a new obstacle: rivers and large gaps. Once again, it was the tank that had helped them in their initial assault that provided the solution, the Churchill. This is an Armoured Vehicle Launched Bridge, or AVLB, mounted on the back of a Churchill chassis. The AVLB's bridge was 32 feet long and could support 40-ton vehicles. Operated by a Royal Engineer driver and commander, it could be erected in only 90 seconds. Getting men and machine across rivers and ravines has been a centuries-old problem. At the Royal Engineers Museum in Kent, in the southeast of England, is a remarkable collection of models, designed to train engineers how to build bridges across rivers and ditches in combat situations.
If you have any sort of support, such as trucks or jeeps or armoured vehicles, you can't get them across unless you've got a ford. You also can't really get men across if they have to wade or swim across the river. That's going to be quite difficult. These bridges and pontoon models were used by the soldiers of the Royal Engineers for training purposes. They would do it in a workshop, so they understood how the bridges were put together before going out and using them in the field.
But the Churchill AVLB bridge layer showed that sometimes a bridge is best built at speed and brought by a tank. It was one of many designs. Another successful tank bridge created by the British was known as the Armoured Ramp Carrier, or ARC. This is a 50-ton version, Built in the 1960s over the chassis of a British Centurion tank. Uniquely, the tank itself would become the bridge. Michael Bamsey has been in the Royal Engineers for almost 30 years and has crewed dozens of combat vehicles. He now instructs other engineers, known as sappers, how to operate them.
Basically, this vehicle would be driven into the hole in the ground or into the river, indeed, and basically it's fitted currently with a bridge on top.
The armoured ramp carrier had two extendable ramps that folded out front and back. This created a trackway across which a battle group could drive. The Ark could create a bridge 78 feet long and operate in a river up to 7 feet deep.
It would drive into the hole, deploy the ramps, and then sit there until the people have finished driving over it.
This combat machine is one Michael Bamsey knows well. The Chieftain AVLB. He was a member of an AVLB crew in Europe and the Middle East. First introduced in 1974, it has been used by the Royal Engineers for over 30 years.
It was operated in the first Gulf War. It also went to Kosovo in 2000, which was the first time armoured engineers had deployed inside of Europe since the end of the Second World War. So it's been the workhorse, if you like, of the armoured engineer fleet.
It would take the Chieftain's hydraulics about 3 minutes to unfold the bridge to its full length of 78 feet. The bridge was deployed using a well-rehearsed routine.
That would be an engineer recce sergeant normally that would have found the ideal spot. The bridge there then will probably come to his right-hand side and to lay the scissor bridge, and then the bridge will literally scissor open and lay down the full 26 metres of hard track.
Under fire, the Royal Engineers had to move quickly.
Clearly 3 to 4 minutes in a hot zone with a lot of high explosive flying is quite a long time to be stood still, so the faster we can get that bridge down and away, the safer everybody would be.
The Royal Engineers who crewed these machines had a strong bond.
It does build a certain camaraderie, and it was like a nice, tight-knit crew. It was a very niche trade to be in inside of the Royal Engineers.
The greatest test the Royal Engineers ever faced was the bloodiest conflict of the 20th century, the First World War. In 1914, the British Army had 25,000 Royal Engineers, but that number rapidly increased due to the demands of new technology and the wide range of tasks only they could do. The trench warfare that began in 1914 soon resulted in a stalemate. Thousands of lives were lost just to advance a few yards. One solution to break the deadlock was an old siege tactic, tunneling under the enemy's position, laying explosives and blowing them up. In the 17th century, it was the Royal Engineers' forebears who dug these tunnels, or saps as they were known, earning them the nickname sappers.
Given their previous history as sappers and miners, it was very natural that the Royal Engineers should be selected for the formation of tunnelling companies in 1915. These companies, often consisting of former miners and mining engineers, were to burrow their way underneath the German lines and lay charges. 1915 was thus an advance in technology and also a look back to the past.
A successful tunnel relied not just on manpower and effective digging tools, but on an ingenious combat machine, the Geophone. It revolutionized underground warfare.
It was especially useful because it could tell not only where enemy miners were mining nearby, but the direction of where they were mining from.
At the start of the war, basic listening devices were used to detect enemy digging, like this simple wooden listening stick.
Soldiers would be sat at the listening posts. They would often use tin boxes filled with water, and they would look for ripples within the water to see the vibrations of people mining nearby.
Then in 1915, the Geophone arrived in the tunnels. The idea of a French professor named Jean Perrin. The Geophone could detect sound vibrations travelling through the earth. It was so sensitive, it could pick up the noise of men walking on the trench boards overhead, but also, crucially, the Germans working underground. The sappers' work was dangerous. As a result, they were paid 4 times more than their comrades on the surface.
The conditions were difficult at best. There were hazards from collapsing tunnels and the pressures of ventilation underground. Carbon monoxide poisoning was often a common occurrence, and at worst there were skirmishes and face-to-face battles underground.
But in this subterranean world, the Geophone gave the Royal Engineers a distinct advantage.
The Geophone would amplify the sounds made underground, and it could hear noises from 100 feet away in clay and in chalky strata about 250 feet.
In 1915, British Land Sergeant Charles Quinnell of the Royal Fusiliers was sent to help sappers digging a tunnel on the Western Front. One was using a Geophone.
Every now and again, we'd have to stop work. If he could hear the Germans working, you were quite safe. It was when you didn't hear a noise, you knew the Germans were going to blow.
The advance warning given by the Geophone also meant that the sappers could dig counter-tunnels and literally undermine the enemy. The Geophone was fairly straightforward for the sapper to operate. 2 amplifiers are linked by a rubber tube similar to a stethoscope. As sound waves hit the Geophone amplifier, its metal casing moves, but a metal weight inside the Geophone, floating in mercury, remains still. This results in air pressure inside the Geophone compressing and expanding, sending rhythmic puffs of air up the tube to the operator's ears.
Once you discovered a sound underground, you'd add the second amplifier to the Geophone, and by moving them around and finding a balance for that sound in the earpieces, you could, by putting a compass between them, create a bearing for where the enemy mining was going on.
When you were down below, we had always to speak in whispers. One day I crept up to the chap who was listening and asked him by signs, "Can I have a listen?" He handed the stethoscope to me, and I could distinctly hear the Germans talking.
A successfully completed tunnel full of explosives could have a devastating effect. Mines were often detonated just before a new offensive was about to begin. The results were craters over 250 feet across and 50 feet deep, hundreds of casualties, and for a valuable few minutes on the battlefield, a stunned and more vulnerable adversary. All with the help of a small but effective combat machine. Over the years, the Royal Engineers have become familiar with this lethal weapon of war, the landmine. They dealt with the threat with a cunning combat machine that transformed World War II battlefields. But in modern wars, they've also become expert at laying mines with remarkable speed. In 1941, 2 years into the Second World War, the British government had a problem. Fearing a German invasion, the elite British Army Corps, the Royal Engineers, had laid thousands of landmines around the coast to deter a hostile landing force. But no one knew where they were buried.
The whole of the periphery of the island was covered in mines. After the threat of invasion subsided, the British government decided that they might want to move the mines or take them up altogether. They had a problem. They hadn't kept proper detail of where the mines were.
To make matters worse, on the battlefields of Europe, Russia, and North Africa, the German army were using mines on a massive scale.
The German fortifications and defences, which had been prepared over years, contained extensive minefields. Mines that would deal with tanks, mines that were anti-personnel, and actually wherever they put a tank mine were actually surrounded by small anti-personnel mines, so that people clearing them might well be killed not by the main mine but by something nearby.
Minefields were sown by both sides with a specific, deadly purpose.
They would enable a defending force to concentrate the attacker into killing zones. So, for example, you'd sow minefields and leave perhaps a roadway or an area in the middle, which would be a natural course for your invader or attacker to come down, and then you'd make sure all your weapons were focused on that.
Landmines were not a new threat. Soldiers had been faced with the prospect of being maimed or killed by these deadly devices for almost 100 years. This is one of the very first landmines, dating from the Crimean War of the mid-1850s, a conflict fought between Russia on one side and the French and the British on the other. This Russian landmine would be partially buried on the battlefield.
All the way beneath the ground would be the box of gunpowder, and attached to the top would be this landmine with a pressure plate. And when it was stepped on, the pressure plate would dip down and create an electrical circuit, which would then ignite the gunpowder, resulting in a huge explosion.
The power of the landmine would have come as a shock to the British and French soldiers.
The Crimea War had a great deal of new technology, and so things like the landmine would have been new to a lot of the troops, and they wouldn't have seen things like this before, and just the effect of them, let alone the explosion, could have been quite terrifying.
100 years later, in 1941, the British urgently needed a machine to help them detect this underground menace. The army set up an official board to find a solution. A Polish officer named Józef Kosacki, who had fled to Britain in 1939 after the outbreak of the Second World War, submitted his invention. In tests, it proved to be highly successful and became known as the Polish Mine Detector Mark I. Responsibility for the new mine detector was given to the Royal Engineers.
It consists of a mine detector head, which has coils in it, cable going up to a backpack, which is quite heavy, weighs about 25 kilos, in which there is an oscillator, an amplifier and batteries to run the same. I have a control panel here in front of me. This controls the sensitivity of the unit and controls for testing purposes.
The technology involved was simple, but extremely effective. The oscillator in the backpack sends an audio signal to a coil in the detector head. When close to metal like a landmine, the balance between the coil and a second coil attached to an amplifier is upset, causing an oscillating signal to be sent to the operator's headphones.
So to hold the detecting head at least 3 or 4 inches above the surface of the ground would detect a mine measured to a depth of about 6 inches, quite comfortably. Well, these heads were quite heavy, so it can pull you off balance quite a bit. You need quite a bit of practice to get used to the equipment, and it can be very fatiguing over long periods of time. But it's very important because the troops behind you can't move forward until you've completely cleared the ground of mines.
The Polish mine detector was used to great effect in the Second World War North Africa campaign of 1940 to 43. Where the British fought to stop the Germans and Italians seizing control of Egypt and the Suez Canal. 500 mine detectors were issued to the Royal Engineers. They proved vital at the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, the turning point of the Desert War. Under fire from the Germans, the sappers cleared minefields that were in places 600 feet wide, allowing infantry and tanks to advance.
The Royal Engineers would clear a lane through the minefield and put white tapes down the side, and the middle passage between those tapes was safe, Everything beyond that had to be dealt with later. And that was a really hazardous, painstaking process.
The technology behind Joseph Kosaki's invention was shared with other nations, including the Americans.
Lieutenant Kosaki was one of those sort of people that dabbled in electrics, loved the results of his research, and wasn't really interested in any financial gain for what he did.
The Royal Engineers have not only been responsible for detecting mines, they have also been given the role of laying them. For decades, this was done by hand. Until this combat machine arrived. First introduced into the British Army in the 1990s. The 10-ton mine-laying vehicle known as the Shielder. A task that would have taken a unit of Royal Engineers days could now be done by a crew of 2 in a matter of minutes.
Its full title is a scatterable mine launching system, and the crew can launch mines from within the vehicle at up to 40-odd miles an hour. And the fact that you can drive at a fairly high speed around a battlefield, and you can change the area that you want to actually put mines in, gives the commander of the battlefield a minute's notice. He's just got to get on the radio and tell the crew, I want you to sow this particular area.
The mines can be launched from either side of the Shielder. The width and density of the minefield is determined by the angle of the pods.
So you can have a wide minefield, thin, or you can have a very narrow minefield, thickly sown, depending on the battlefield that the commander wants.
At the rear of the Shielder are devices to allow it to function on the battlefield, hidden.
All British vehicles, in fact most track vehicles around the world, have smoke launchers, and they're fired as a salvo each side. Something like a chieftain will have 6 a side, and the idea of this is it can be fired and you can cover the battleground with smoke, and you can retreat away from the battle if you wish, or you can fire them forward and advance under the cover of smoke.
The driver of the Shielder controls the vehicle not by a wheel, but with steering tillers.
A track vehicle, if you want to turn left, you pull the tiller back, and the harder you pull it back and you give the accelerator some revs, the vehicle will literally turn on a sixpence.
Although this combat machine carried a lethal load, its mines were very different from those from previous wars. They were not designed to stay in the ground for months or years at a time.
But there's 600 mines on board, and these mines are programmable, so for self-destruct. So they can be programmed for 24, 48 hours, 72 hours, because the world conditions now is that one does not leave live mines on a battlefield.
For decades, the British Army had faced deadly landmines and lethal, unexploded bombs. But in the 1970s, they found themselves facing a new threat, the car bomb. One of the legacies of the Second World War was a huge quantity of unexploded bombs, or UXBs. Since the end of the conflict in 1945, the responsibility for bomb disposal has been with the Royal Engineers. This machine from the 1950s, known as a drill master, made by a company whose expertise was in oil exploration, was used to find and deal with unexploded German wartime bombs buried deep up to 260 feet underground. But at the end of the 1960s, the British Army needed a piece of equipment for a very different bomb disposal challenge. In 1968, tensions between the Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland erupted into violence. British troops were deployed to keep order. Events escalated, and the paramilitary group, the IRA, began a bombing campaign aimed at the security forces and civilian targets. Bombs, often placed in abandoned cars, became a constant threat. Because of their World War II experience, Royal Engineers often helped the Army bomb disposal teams with location and removal.
The damage that some of these bombs could do, one of my incidences was a 500-pound bomb. The crater that it left in the street was massive, and every pane of glass down the high street on both sides was taken out.
The leader of the Army bomb disposal team was the ATO, the Ammunition Technician Officer. The devices often had multiple booby traps. It was a highly dangerous job.
In those early stages, the ATO, the risk was great because he had nothing. Each time he walked to the device was another walk of danger. The ATO was the only one who would approach the device, and the ATO was the only one who would dismantle the device, and it's the only ATO would be the one who would be able to clear the area for safety. So there was quite a lot on the ATO's shoulders.
In 1972, 8 ATOs were killed. The deaths prompted an officer in the British Royal Tank Regiment named Peter Miller to invent a combat machine that allowed bomb disposal teams to keep a safe distance. This is the ingenious bomb disposal robot known as the wheelbarrow. It earned its unlikely nickname because the chassis from the prototype came from an ordinary electrically powered wheelbarrow bought from a garden centre. Initially, its attachments were fairly basic, and the machine was steered from a distance with ropes. But over the years, it became more sophisticated and was upgraded to be remote-controlled. And it was given tank tracks that meant it could even climb stairs. Wayne Cox was part of a British Army bomb disposal team that operated the robot. His role was to ensure that whoever planted the bomb wasn't going to detonate it remotely.
The first thing that would happen is I would set up my equipment. We would do the scan to ensure that there was no remote control devices. Once I was happy that the area was clear, I would then inform the ATO, and then he would then tell me to switch my equipment to passive. And my equipment, what that would do, it would block any signals being transmitted from any remote control device.
The wheelbarrow would then be deployed. With the arrival of the remarkable remote-controlled robot, the risk to the ATO was dramatically reduced.
Instead of the ATO doing the walk to the device, we could send the wheelbarrow. He then could make a lot more decisions in the safety back where we were.
The wheelbarrow was controlled with a handheld device.
What we have here is the main control unit for the wheelbarrow. It has various functions on it to move it forward, to move it back, left and right. What we also have is be able to detonate the charges that we have by using these switches here. Also, what you'll see is we have the umbilical cord. This obviously is a short one, but normally when deployed, we would have it deployed on the 100 meters umbilical cord. On the wheelbarrow itself, we would have these two arms with two actuators. This would allow the boom to move forward and back so we could then manoeuvre it towards the vehicle.
The bomb disposal team worked carefully, step by step. The wheelbarrow had a tool for every stage of the process. Attached to the top of the boom was a powerful shotgun.
This would be able to be fired remotely from the actual control box. We would use this to shoot the windows out of the vehicle, so then we could deploy the boom into the window, into the car, to see what we needed to see. We would then want to deploy any devices that the ATO would want to use inside the vehicle. To do this, we would then extend this part of the boom forward to wherever necessary into the vehicle.
At either side of the front of the boom were two devices known as pig sticks that would fire a jet of water at the bomb, disrupting its timers, rendering it ineffective. An explosive designed not to cause a fire might be dropped from the end of the wheelbarrow's boom to open the door's boot and bonnet.
If there was a booby trap on the rear door or front door or boot or bonnet, because it blew it open anyway, it would have gone off.
What we'd also have on the boom is a camera. This camera would allow us to see whereabouts we are putting it into the vehicle so that it was deployed correctly. Once the ATO was happy where the device was, then we then could bring the boom back out and then remove the wheelbarrow from the vehicle, deploy it back to a safe place, and then we could then detonate the charge, what the ATO had just deployed into the car bomb itself.
The final task of the ATO would be a careful walk towards the bomb.
He would then inspect to ensure that the device was safe. Once the ATO had cleared the area, then we would then go in and look for forensics.
The work of Wayne's team was often appreciated by the public. After an incendiary bomb was defused at a furniture store, they received an unexpected gift.
I remember sitting in the kitchen of the owners, and we were just having a cup of tea, and they just could not thank us enough. And we was talking about furniture, and in our old little ops room where we used to wait for the call out, we had an old two-seater settee, and the owners said, go and choose one. So they took us in, and we chose a little two-settee, we put it in the back of the van, and we took it back to our ops room, and it was a nice appreciation.
The wheelbarrow made bomb disposal safer for the army teams. But the robot didn't completely remove danger.
We've had another incident, the bomb hadn't gone off. So we was taking the wheelbarrow in and we'd shot out the windows. But unfortunately, it was booby-trapped. And the whole car just blew up. And so did the wheelbarrow. Unfortunately, the roof of the car was coming at us. And you know, we just hit the deck as the roof went past us. You've got to be quite on your feet when you're there. You can't relax. I felt scared sometimes, you know, because of where we were. But I think being scared keeps you on your edge, and so you never took nothing for granted. Because when you take something for granted, then that's when people can be hurt. Everybody knew their job. We all were together. We were a small family. We just looked after each other.
Lieutenant Colonel Peter Miller's remote-controlled combat machine has been copied around the world. During its service in Northern Ireland, it saved many lives.
I believe that there's approximately 400 wheelbarrows which have been lost through explosives. I think 400 lives were saved, because if we hadn't have had the wheelbarrow, it could be 400 ATOs which could have been lost.
The Royal Engineers have had centuries of experience operating outstanding combat machines. Machines that can create bridges in minutes, detect and lay mines, and destroy enemy fortifications. British sappers can justifiably claim to be the ultimate combat engineers.